My company tried to destroy 14 years of my life in a single meeting. They called it a disciplinary hearing. They had a printed list. They had a woman in HR I had never seen before, sitting at the corner of the table with a notepad. They had that particular corporate stillness that a room gets when something has been pre-decided and the conversation is just the paperwork. They accused me of gross misconduct. Gross misconduct? 14 years. Not a single formal warning in all that time. Not one. I had trained their staff, salvaged their biggest client account 3 separate times, and driven more miles in my own car on their behalf than I care to add up. 14 years of that, and they sat across from me with a printed list and the word misconduct. I read the list. I read it carefully. The way you read something when you already know it is wrong, but you want to make absolutely sure before you say anything. And then I looked up. And I said the only thing there was to say. None of this is accurate. They were not expecting that. I could tell from the shift in the room, the HR woman's pen stopping, the new owner recrossing her arms, the pause that lasts just a beat too long before someone decides to speak. But I was not angry. That is the thing I want you to understand before we go any further. I was not angry. I was very, very calm. Because by the time I walked into that room, I had already done my homework. I already knew my rights. I had already spoken to a solicitor. I had already read every line of my contract, and I had already decided exactly how this was going to go. If you're watching this, click on the subscribe button now, because this is the story of how a company handed me a list of false accusations and I handed them back the bill. I want to tell you about the company I loved before I tell you about the company that tried to destroy me. Because they were the same building, and the same address, and the same name on the door, but they were not the same place. I joined when I was in my mid-20s. Not because it was a dream job, it was never glamorous. Never the kind of work people envy at dinner parties, but because it was good, honest, skilled work. And the people running it were good, honest people. That matters more than it sounds. When the people at the top are decent, it ripples down into everything. The way problems get solved, the way staff are spoken to, the way a mistake is treated as something to learn from rather than something to weaponize. For 12 years, I thrived there. I knew the job so well, it had become part of how I thought. I could read a situation before it became a problem. I knew the clients, their habits, their preferences, the small things that made the difference between a transaction and a relationship. I had that particular, unquantifiable value that comes from time. The knowledge that only exists because you were there for the thing that happened 7 years ago, and the thing that happened 4 years ago, and the thing that happened last spring, and you remember how each one resolved. The owners value that. They were not effusive about it, it was a practical culture. Not a sentimental one, but they showed it in the way that matters. They paid fairly, they listened, they trusted me with responsibility. I was given keys, I was given accounts, I was given problems, and the latitude to solve them. For 12 years, that was the shape of my working life. And then, in the space of about 6 months, it changed completely. The original owners sold the company. I was not consulted, which is not a complaint owners sell. It is their right, but I want to be honest about what that moment felt like. You spend over a decade building something, not something you own, but something you are deeply part of. And then one day you find out it has been transferred to someone else's hands without any of the people who built it having any say in the matter. It is legal, it is common, and it hits you somewhere that is not quite rational but is very real. The new owner arrived with ideas. That is always how it starts with new owners who do not understand what they have bought. They arrive with ideas. Her name is not something I will give you. She had the confidence of someone who had purchased authority and was now in the process of asserting it. And the methods she chose were the methods that people choose when they have power without understanding. The first thing she did was restructure the pay. Salaries became wages, and not equivalent wages, reduced ones. The experienced staff took cuts that could not be justified by any honest reading of the business finances. Some of them left immediately. They were older, they had options, they knew their value in the market, and they exercised it without drama. They were gone within weeks. The second thing she did was begin laying off the remaining experienced staff. Not for performance reasons, for cost reasons, dressed up as performance reasons in the way that is now so common it has its own language. Restructuring, role redundancy, strategic realignment, the vocabulary of efficiency applied to the reality of cutting the people who knew the most and replacing them with people who would cost less. I watched this happen around me and I did two things. I kept doing my job to the standard I had always kept, and I started paying very close attention. She kept me. That was the interesting part. When the layoffs came, I was not on the list. I had assumed, in the darker moments, that my time was coming, that seniority and salary made me a target. But she came to me directly and told me she needed me. She needed me to train the new intake. She needed me to transfer the knowledge I had spent 14 years accumulating into people who had been in the building for 4 weeks. I agreed to do this because it was the professional thing to do. I want to be clear about that. I was not naive. I could see what was happening, but I had not yet given her a reason to doubt my professionalism, and I was not going to. What I was also doing, quietly, during this period, was documenting everything. Every instruction, every interaction, every promise made and not kept. I kept records the way a person keeps records when they already sense that records are going to matter. They mattered sooner than I expected. I was called in without notice. That is the first tell. When someone calls you into a meeting without notice, without an agenda, without the courtesy of preparation time, they are already controlling the encounter. They want you off balance, unprepared, reactive. I was not off balance, but I did not let her know that.
If you don't feel this arrangement works for you, we can end your employment. We'd give you 2 weeks' notice, and you'd be free to find something more suited. 2 weeks. My contract said 12. That is not a misremembering. I had read it again the previous week because some part of me had known this conversation was coming. My contract was clear, 12 weeks' notice. She was either unaware of this, which suggested incompetence, or aware of it and hoping I wasn't, which suggested something else. I did not correct her in that meeting. I nodded. I said I would need some time to consider. I walked out and went directly to a solicitor.
There is a particular kind of power that comes from preparation. Not the loud kind, not the power of volume or aggression or the ability to speak over people. The quiet kind. The kind that exists in knowing exactly what a piece of paper says and knowing that the other person doesn't. The solicitor confirmed what I already believed. My contract was binding. The 12 weeks notice was not a suggestion, it was a legal obligation. If the company wanted to end my employment, they owed me 12 weeks, not 2. At my existing salary, with my existing benefits, intact throughout. I also learned something else in that meeting, something that sharpened the picture considerably. The company had a major client, their single most significant account, the kind of client that a business like that is built around, without fully admitting it. A long-term relationship, built over years, generating a substantial portion of the company's revenue. And that client had, at some point, decided that I was the person they dealt with. Not the company in the abstract, me. They had my direct contact, they trusted my judgment. They had told the previous owners, more than once, that the relationship worked because of continuity. If I was gone, that client would have to decide whether to stay. I knew this. I had known this for some time. I had not weaponized it. I want to be clear about that, but I had noted it. And now, sitting in a solicitor's office, understanding that my legal position was considerably stronger than my new owner had assumed, the significance of that knowledge came into focus. The company could not afford to lose me. Not cleanly, not quickly. Every week I remained was a week the client relationship was intact. Every week I was absent was a week that client sat in uncertainty with no trusted contact and every reason to take their business elsewhere. She had handed me leverage I had not asked for by trying to shortchange me on a contract she had not read carefully enough. I went home and prepared my response. 3 days later, they called me back in. This time there was an HR person I had never seen before. This time there was a printed document on the table. This time, the energy in the room was different, tighter, more deliberate. They had decided not to negotiate. They had decided to remove the problem differently. The document was a list of alleged misconduct. Gross misconduct, specifically the category that, if upheld, allows a company to terminate employment immediately and without the notice period the contract requires. It is the nuclear option in employment law, and they had reached for it. I read the list, every item on it. The centerpiece of their case was a claim that I had broken health and safety laws in the way I carried out a specific delivery method for a customer. It was detailed. It had dates. It had the appearance of substance. There were two problems with it. The first was that it was not true. I had not broken any health and safety laws. I knew this with absolute certainty because the delivery method in question was one I had been using for years, one I had been trained in, one that the previous owners had never once raised as an issue. The second problem was worse for them. She had watched me do it multiple times. She had not only observed the delivery method she was now calling illegal, she had instructed me to train new staff in it. She had asked me to pass this method on to the people she had hired to replace the experienced workers she had laid off. She had, in other words, explicitly endorsed the very thing she was now calling gross misconduct. I let the silence after the reading of the list run a little long. Then I looked up. I'd like to respond to each of these in writing, with documentation. The HR woman's pen paused. My new owner's expression shifted in a way that told me she had not anticipated that sentence. I was not angry. I was extremely, precisely calm. I am not a lawyer. I want to say that clearly because what I did next might sound like the action of someone with legal training, and it was not. It was the action of someone who had read everything carefully, documented everything thoroughly, and understood that the facts, presented without emotion, were on her side. I spent a weekend on the written response. My solicitor reviewed it. Every accusation on their list was addressed, point by point, with a corresponding document, date, or record. For the central accusation, the health and safety claim, I produced the following: my original training records for the delivery method, showing who had trained me and when. The instructions I had been given by the previous management, confirming the method, and the internal communications, which I had kept, in which the new owner had instructed me to pass this method on to new staff. Let me say that again slowly. She had asked me, in writing, to teach the thing she was now calling illegal. The request existed. I had kept it, and it was now in the document I submitted in my defense. The response to the written defense came quickly. I think it surprised them, the speed and the completeness of it. They had expected someone who would be on the back foot. They had expected the power dynamic of an employer presenting accusations to an employee who had no preparation and no documentation. They had not expected the documentation. The meeting that followed was brief. The HR woman did most of the talking, which I had noticed was a pattern whenever things were going poorly for the ownership side. She said the company was still considering its position. She used the phrase, reviewing the evidence. I nodded and said that was fine. Then I said the thing I had been waiting to say. While you're reviewing, I want to make sure we're aligned on my notice period. My contract specifies 12 weeks. I'll be working those 12 weeks in full, at my current salary, and with my current benefits, starting from today. The room was very quiet. Then she spoke.
We offered you 2 weeks.
You offered me 2 weeks. My contract says 12. I'm holding you to the contract. Another silence. Longer this time. She had no move. She had tried to fabricate a gross misconduct case, and the fabrication had collapsed against documentation. She had tried to offer a shortened notice period, and the contract did not support it. She had tried to apply pressure, and the pressure had found nothing to compress against. The hands were tied. All of them. Here is what malicious compliance looks like when it is applied to a professional setting by someone who has been there 14 years and is not interested in burning anything down. I did my job. Every single day of those 12 weeks, I did exactly the job I had always done, to the exact standard I had always maintained. I arrived on time. I completed every task I was assigned. I did not coast. I did not slow walk. I did not do the minimum. I did the thing I had always done, which was the thing that had made me indispensable in the first place. The client, the significant one, received the same service they always had. I was their contact. I answered their calls. I managed their account. They noticed nothing had changed, because for them, nothing had. I was still there, still professional, still the person they trusted. The difference was the clock. Every week I worked was a week she was paying me the full salary she had tried to remove. Every week I worked was a week the client relationship held, and a week she could not fill my role with someone cheaper without risking losing that relationship. The leverage was not something I wielded. I simply stayed in the room and let its existence do what it would do. I also did something else during those 12 weeks, quietly. I began exploring what came next. I had skills that were more transferable than I had allowed myself to believe during years in one industry. I talked to people I had not spoken to professionally in some time. I had conversations that started as exploratory and became interesting and then became concrete. I was not frantic about it. I had 12 weeks of salary. I had documentation of everything, and I had a solicitor who had confirmed my legal position was strong. I could afford to be measured. By week 10, I had something lined up: different industry, better pay, better ownership, fewer miles, and more flexibility. I said nothing to her about any of it. I want to tell you about the last day the way I actually experienced it, rather than the way a story wants it to be. It was quiet. That is the most honest thing I can say about it. There was no confrontation. There was no dramatic final scene. There was a last shift, completed to the same standard as the first 13 years and 50 weeks of shifts before it. And then there was a handover document, thorough, clear, professional, and then there was the door. I did not badmouth the company on the way out. Not to the client, not to colleagues, not anywhere in any form that could be traced back to a conversation or a comment. That mattered to me not because I was protecting her, but because I was protecting myself. The solicitor had said, "Leave nothing they can use." I left nothing. I said goodbye to the people I had worked alongside for years. A few of them had already left. The experienced ones she had laid off had long since moved on. The newer ones I had trained were polite, a little awkward, in the way people are when they know more about a situation than they are supposed to and are trying to pretend otherwise. The client called me that afternoon. They had somehow found out these things move through industry networks faster than companies ever anticipate, and they wanted to know what was happening. I was professional. I told them I was moving to a new opportunity. I told them I was confident the company would provide continuity of service. I told them exactly as much as I was permitted to tell them, and not a word more. They were not reassured. I could hear it in the call. The relationship they had was with a person, not a brand. And the person was leaving, and no amount of professional language changes what that means to a client who has spent years building trust with a specific human being. I said goodbye. I meant it. And I closed that chapter. She contested it. I want to be honest about that because the story has a satisfying shape, and I do not want to sand off the rough edges in a way that makes it feel less real. She contested the notice period, the salary during notice, the legitimacy of my defense documentation. She hired her own legal representation. It went on for a year. That part is less cinematic than the rest of it, and it is the part that costs something even when you are on the right side of things. Legal processes are slow and expensive, and they require a kind of sustained attention that sits in the background of your life, like weather you cannot ignore. I had started my new job by then. I was doing well there. And simultaneously, I was maintaining a legal case against a woman who had tried to fire me with fabricated misconduct charges and then refused to honor my notice period. It settled out of court. I cannot give you numbers because the settlement included the usual confidentiality arrangements around specific figures, and I am not interested in testing those arrangements. What I can tell you is that the settlement was in my favor and that she paid. The documentation had done what documentation does when it is thorough and accurate and assembled by someone who kept records because they sensed records would matter. It was not instant justice. I want to be clear about that for anyone who might be in a situation like this and hoping for a swift resolution. It took a year. It cost money and attention and energy. It required a solicitor I had to pay and a patience I had to maintain and a willingness to stay focused when the easier thing would have been to let it go. I did not let it go. Not because I am vindictive, I am not, particularly, but because the principle mattered to me. What she had tried to do was wrong. The false accusations were wrong. The shortened notice was wrong. The attempt to use the power differential of employer over employee to erase 14 years of contractual rights was wrong. And I was not going to absorb that and call it the cost of doing business. So I didn't. I heard about it in pieces. The way you hear about things when you have left, but still know people on the inside. The way that small industries talk to themselves. The client left. Not immediately, they gave the company a chance to demonstrate that continuity was possible, which it wasn't, because the knowledge I had spent 14 years accumulating was not transferable in a 12-week handover document, however thorough. The relationship they had with me could not be replicated with someone who had been in the role for 5 months and had learned the account from a file rather than from years of presence. The client left within 9 months. The replacement they hired to cover my role, the person who was supposed to step into the gap I left, quit within a few weeks. The word that reached me, secondhand through the network that small industries have, was that she had described the working environment as one she did not feel safe in. An untrustworthy employer, in the phrasing that got back to me. Untrustworthy, the reviews started. Online Google, Facebook, the places where customers and former employees leave their accounts of things. The ratings went down. The language in the reviews was specific and detailed in the way that reviews are specific and detailed when people are writing from actual experience rather than from vague dissatisfaction. Words like unprofessional, words like unsafe, words that, individually, might not mean much, but accumulate into a pattern that a prospective client reads and decides is not worth the risk. And then COVID hit. The business, already weakened, faced the shutdown like every business did. She canceled orders, apparently, and declined to issue refunds, citing force majeure clauses in contracts in a way that her customers found neither legally satisfying nor humanly acceptable. More reviews, more departures, more of the reputational weight that builds when a business has burned through goodwill on multiple fronts simultaneously. The business is still technically alive, as of what I last heard, but only barely. The word I would use is floundering. She would have a different word, I imagine. She would have words about the market and the pandemic and the impossible conditions of the current business environment. She would not have words about the 14 years of accumulated expertise she tried to discard at minimum wage, or about the client relationship she could not replace, or about the false accusations that had cost her a year of legal fees and a settlement that landed in someone else's account. Those parts are never in their version of the story. I want to talk about this directly because it is the thing I hear least often discussed when people talk about workplace situations and the thing that made the most difference in mine. Documentation is not paranoia. I want to say that clearly because when I tell people I kept records, every email, every written instruction, every exchange of any significance, the word that sometimes appears on their face is that one. Paranoid. Like the act of keeping records is an act of distrust or suspicion. It is not. Or rather, it is distrust in the sense that all professional self protection is a form of distrust, a recognition that the goodwill of an employer is contingent and not contractual, and that contracts exist precisely because goodwill is not reliable. I did not keep records because I expected to need them. I kept records because I was a professional, and professionals keep records. When I needed them, I had them. The specific document that changed the course of everything, the written instruction in which she had asked me to train staff in the exact delivery method she later accused me of performing illegally, that existed because I kept things. Not because I was plotting, because I was thorough. 14 years of that kind of thoroughness had made me valuable to the business. The same thoroughness, applied to my own protection, made the business unable to harm me the way they had tried to. These are not different things. They are expressions of the same professional habit, the habit of taking things seriously, the habit of creating records that the future can refer to, the habit of doing the job properly, including the parts of the job that are about protecting yourself as a worker with rights. Know your contract. Read it. Not when there is a problem before there is a problem. Know your notice period. Know your benefits. Know the specific, concrete obligations your employer has to you in writing, not the verbal ones, the written ones, the ones that exist in a document someone signed. And keep everything. I am earning more now than I was before. I am working fewer hours. The people I work for are decent in the way the original owners were decent, the way that shows up not in grand statements but in small daily choices, the kind you stop noticing when you are used to them, and notice acutely when you have been without them. No fabricated accusations. No meetings without notice. No pay cuts dressed up in the language of opportunity. No one trying to extract 14 years of knowledge at minimum wage and then discarding the person who had it. I want to be careful not to make this sound easy. The year of the legal case was not easy. Finding the new role required effort and courage of a kind that is harder to describe than the malicious compliance part of the story, which is the satisfying part. Leaving a place where you have spent 14 years, even a place that has stopped deserving your loyalty, involves a kind of grief that does not have a clean shape. You mourn the version of the place it used to be. You mourn the colleagues who left before you. You mourn, sometimes, the simpler version of yourself who arrived there at 20-something and thought the arrangement was going to be permanent. None of that is weakness. It is honesty. And the honesty of it is part of why I am telling the story at full length, rather than in the compressed version, where I outsmart a bad employer and walk away unscathed. I was scathed. I was tired. I was, for parts of that year, genuinely angry in the low burning way that does not announce itself loudly but sits behind everything else. And I won anyway. Not easily, not quickly, but cleanly. I did not coast. I did not slack. I did not badmouth the company on my way out. I worked the 12 weeks I was owed, and I received the payment I was owed, and I left the situation better prepared for the next one than I had ever been in the 14 years before. That is the version of winning that I am proud of. There is a pattern, and I have seen it now, in my own experience and in the stories of everyone who has reached out since I first told a version of this publicly, a very specific pattern in how a certain kind of bad employer operates when they have decided to remove someone they believe is vulnerable. It goes like this. First, they create the conditions for the departure, the pay cut, the restructure, the offer that is designed to be refused. Then, when the person doesn't comply quietly, they escalate. They reach for the accusation, the misconduct, the performance management paper trail assembled retroactively to justify a decision that was already made. The assumption underpinning all of it is that the employee is not resourced, does not know their rights, has not read their contract, cannot afford a solicitor, or does not know how to find one. Will absorb the accusation and the reduced offer and the power of the institution behind the manager and will simply go. Take the 2 weeks, sign the exit document, disappear without requiring anything more than the minimum. That assumption is sometimes correct. People are tired. People are frightened. People have mortgages and dependents, and all the reasons that the power imbalance between an employer and an individual employee is as significant as it is. The assumption of vulnerability is not always wrong, but it is not always right. And what I want to say to anyone listening who is in the early stages of a situation like this, the pay cut conversation, the sudden disciplinary interest, the meeting without an agenda, is that the assumption of your vulnerability is only as accurate as you allow it to be. You have rights. They are written down somewhere, in a document that belongs to you as much as it belongs to your employer. Find the document, read it, sit with a solicitor for an hour, even if it costs you, because the hour is an investment in the rest of the story. And keep everything, every email, every written instruction, every exchange that has a record attached to it. You may not need any of it. Most situations do not escalate to the place mine did. But if it does escalate, if the meeting comes and the printed list is on the table, the difference between having documentation and not having it is the entire story. It was, in my case, the entire story. The question I get asked most often when I tell this story is some version of, do you regret staying as long as you did? The honest answer is no. Not for the reasons that people expect, not because the bad years were somehow worth it, but because the specific knowledge I had, the knowledge that made me valuable and made my departure costly, only existed because of the 14 years. You cannot build that kind of expertise in 2 years or 5. It requires time in the way that some things simply require time. I was not wasting the last 2 years by staying. I was, without quite knowing it, accumulating the very thing that would eventually protect me. There is a version of this story where I leave the moment the new owner arrives, where I read the room quickly and exit cleanly, and none of the bad part happens. That version is tidier. It is probably also wiser in some abstract sense, but it is not what I did, and I am not certain it would have served me as well in the long run. The legal case, the settlement, the documentation, all of it required the specific shape of what actually happened. A quicker exit might have been a cleaner one, but it would not have produced the outcome it did. What the bad years taught me, years 13 and 14, specifically is something about the difference between loyalty to a place and loyalty to yourself. I was loyal to the company for 12 years because the company deserved it. When it stopped deserving it, I maintained my professionalism, which is not the same thing as loyalty, while simultaneously protecting my interests. Those two things can coexist. They did coexist. And the distinction matters because one of the most common mistakes I see people make in situations like mine is conflating professionalism with submission. Doing your job well is not the same as accepting whatever is done to you. You can do your job exceptionally well and simultaneously be in correspondence with a solicitor about your legal position. You can work the notice period you are contractually owed at the quality you have always maintained and simultaneously be interviewing for other roles. You can be completely professional in your behavior and completely clear-eyed about what the other party is doing. These are not contradictions. They are, in fact, the whole strategy. She said nobody wanted to work anymore. That, apparently, is the story circulating about why the business is floundering, that the workforce today is uncommitted, that young people and experienced people, and anyone who doesn't accept minimum wage for skilled work, have an attitude problem. What she means, though she will not say it their way, is that the workers who came through those doors did the arithmetic. They added up what was being offered against what was being taken, and the numbers didn't balance, and they acted accordingly. That is not an attitude problem. That is basic economic rationality applied to the experience of a working life. The people who work skilled jobs are not asking for the unreasonable. They are asking for the terms written in their contracts. They are asking for the notice periods they were promised. They are asking not to be accused of misconduct for following the procedures their employer trained them in. They are asking, in short, to be dealt with honestly. If you cannot build a workplace where that happens, if honesty feels to you like a constraint rather than a foundation, then the business failing is not an external event. It is the logical conclusion of the choices made at the top. She had me for 14 years. She could have had me for more. She chose to try to remove me with false accusations and a 2-week offer against a 12-week contract. And in doing so, she handed me every legal and moral card in the deck. I did not play them aggressively. I played them precisely. I worked the 12 weeks. I kept the client steady. I left professionally. I pursued the settlement calmly and won it. And then I went to work for people who are decent, where I earn more and travel less, and am not called into meetings with printed accusations. I have to spend my weekends refuting. She lost the client. She lost the staff. She is losing the business. And somewhere in her version of the story, it is still someone else's fault. If this story resonates with you, subscribe to Office Confession for more interesting confessions from workplace and businesses across the globe. I will see you next time. Keep your paperwork, read your contract, and know clearly and specifically and in writing exactly what you are owed.